Geezers. This is the first Speci meta report of the month. We're looking at all the decks I believe to be tier 2 and above. Make sure you subscribe and like the video if it's helpful. We're going to start off with the new source of the month, Electro Sandman. I think this is a solid tier 2 deck. I'm not going to quite put it in tier 1, but it does remain to be seen just how powerful this one is. This is the best list, I believe. The main consideration is playing Claw instead of either Captain Marvel or Magneto. The main thing with this one, of course, is the newly buffed Sandman at 5 energy and 5 stats. You want to be playing Electro on turn 3 and then Sandman on turn 4. And then just playing cards like Doctor Doom on 5 and then Odin on 6, which is going to be very difficult for any deck to compete with. You also have Captain Marvel as another way of getting points into your Ebony Maw lane. Claw would do a similar thing as well. And then Aero is, of course, fantastic. Playing on the final turn into the location you're losing. If you're winning the other two, then Aero is going to be winning you the game. With Sandman in play, it's going to be very difficult for your opponent to fill up that location that you're going to be pulling their cards in with Aero. So Aero is even more difficult to counter with this one. It does have very good matchups into things like Serra Control, potentially Galactus as well, although I've not played that matchup myself, but certainly it really struggles into Shuri and has a very good matchup into Thanos. So bit of a hit and miss deck, really a bit of a rock, paper, scissors kind of deck, if you will, but I think it's very strong. You definitely want these early game cards like Sunspot, Ebony Maw, and Lizard, and I would recommend snapping when you hit Electro into Sandman. Up next, we have Deathwave. I think this is going to be, again, another solid tier 2 deck. Probably a little bit worse than Sandman would be my gut feeling. This is Dara's list from the weekend. I do see quite a lot of these lists playing Chavez as well. And also Iceman, not always the most popular card in this one, but I really do like it as just a little bit of extra edge if you can disrupt your opponent's curve. We all know about Deathwave. It's looking to play Wave on turn number 5, and then on turn 6 playing Death, She-Hulk, and Aero. Of course, this is going to suffer against things like Thanos, where your Aero isn't going to be as impactful because they can fill the board. It's also not going to be as good into Sandman because Sandman is going to be restricting those turn 6 plays that you can make. However, it's still a solid deck, not going to be a big cube gainer. I think this is like lower tier 2. It's a deck I'm not personally a massive fan of, but its power level is definitely there. And next we have a couple of Darkhawk decks. Darkhawk still very strong, not a card I own. This is a Zabu Darkhawk list with Devil Dinosaur and Agent Coulson. Been pretty popular for a little while now. I think it's going to be a solid tier 2 deck. Again, Darkhawk did get nerfed, of course, but only by a point. Really, the bigger nerf in this one is the Zabu nerf that happened a little while ago. I do think that people are underestimating how good Zabu plus Mystique is, and I do think that Zabu decks could creep back into the meta down the line. It's certainly something that I'm going to be exploring, because if you play Zabu on 2, Mystique on 3, you essentially have a pre-nerf Zabu, and you can pull off things like double Spider-Man, all that kind of stuff. This deck doesn't have that, but of course you can use your Mystique on Zabu or on your Darkhawk as well. Here is the other Darkhawk list, and it's going to be a Serra Control Darkhawk deck. Of course, you could play this without Darkhawk as well and just replace the Korg, the Darkhawk, the Rock Slide for other control cards like Enchantress. But you definitely do want this Aero. Aero is going to be crucial at dealing with this Deathwave deck, for example. You're just losing to that deck otherwise. And Aero can also be very good into Shuri decks as well. The idea with this one is you play Serra on turn 5, and then you just play a whole bunch of cards down on turn 6, such as Shang-Chi. Hopefully with that Bishop down on turn 3, your Mysterio can come down on turn number 6 as well, which buffs up your Bishop by 3 points. Your Angela can just tick really nicely as well. This is a big 8-cube victory deck because people don't often see a lot of the points coming. You might be surprised by the lack of Enchantress. I'm just not convinced Enchantress is doing too much in the current meta. A lot of you might say, well, you can hit the Sandman, but ultimately your opponent's playing Sandman on turn 4. You're going to have to Enchantress that on turn 5, and therefore you're not going to get to play Serra. So I do think the introduction of this Electro Sandman deck into the meta is meaning that this kind of Serra control list is going to fall off a bit. So I wouldn't be surprised if this actually falls down to tier 3, but I think lower tier 2 is fair enough. At the moment, obviously, there's so many Sandmans that I'd probably avoid playing this one for the moment. We have Galactus up next. Now, there's a bunch of different ways that you can play Galactus. There's a Shuri Hobgoblin deck doing the rounds at the moment, which I'm pretty interested in checking out. Galactus, unfortunately, a card I still don't own, so I definitely should be picking that up soon. But this is kind of the default version in many ways. This is KM Best's version. It has a bit of an early game with cards like Sunspot Lizard, but the main cards you're really going to want to be playing in every single Galactus deck are going to be Death, Null. I think Dr. Octopus as well is super underrated. And of course, you want that little bit of ramp with Electro and Wave as well. Leech, pretty devastating as an option as well, which can deal with a lot of your opponent's cards, such as your opponent's death, for example, preventing them from being able to play that onto your Galactus lane. I think this is a very solid deck, very underrated still. I think I could see Galactus actually creeping into tier 1 towards the end of the season, once people could sort of finalize the definitive best list. Bunch of different ways you can play it. This is kind of the default way though. And next we have Thanos. I have a couple of decks for Thanos. This is my version of Thanos that I've been playing for the last couple seasons. The one change I've made is I'm playing Armor in here instead of Okoye. I really like Storm and Spider-Man in this list as a sort of control archetype. Very similar looking to Harry's Thanos list, which he won the New York tournament with, which we're also going to take a look at. But America Chavez, very good in any lockjaw deck. You've got the M'Baku and Aero as your turn 6 play. Leech just does a job as well. Spider-Man and Storm locking down locations, I think very underrated. Storm in particular, very good with both Khazar, Blue Marvel, but also, of course, you're able to put points into that location later on with M'Baku as well. But moreover, you can put points in there with the Space Stone movement card. Storm can be a little bit dodgy off of Lockjaw as well, though. It is worth mentioning. So can Spider-Man, but you can also play them both into the Lockjaw lane and get their on-reveal effects, and then they disappear for a later day. So this is my personal go-to Thanos deck, but you can definitely tweak. I think Spider-Man in particular could be taken up for something else. But this is the New York City tournament winner. I just wanted to give you, this is like a more pool 3 friendly version. This is like obviously got Valkyrie, who's now only pool 4, so it's kind of affordable, this deck. If you haven't seen this deck in action, it won the New York tournament. It absolutely popped off. It didn't drop a series the whole week. Very similar kind of list, but with the addition of Valkyrie to secure a location with cards like Blue Marvel, Khazar, Mr. Fantastic. You often have enough points there. If your opponent just has 4 cards and you have 4 cards, you're just going to win the Valkyrie lane with the ongoing effects. But you do, of course, need to make sure you're going second on the turn that you play Valkyrie, or your opponent's location is already full. Spectrum is a very interesting turn 6 play because she's buffing your ongoing cards you're already playing, like Blue Marvel and Khazar, and then Quinjet, Armor as well. With the addition of Mr. Fantastic, Ant-Man, and of course any of the stones which have ongoing effects, your Spectrum can absolutely pop off. Of course, you have the option of playing her into the Lockjaw location as well, and then you can get an extra card off of your Lockjaw. Thanos, of course, got that buff pretty recently as well, so this is just a very formidable tier 1 deck. The other tier 1 deck in my mind this season is going to be Shuri. I have a couple of versions. This is a Shuri Sauron list. Again, I don't have Sauron. I'm not honestly convinced that Sauron is the best way to go with this one. But if you do have Sauron and you want a Shuri list, this is just one I found online thanks to Marvel Snap Zone. Looks pretty solid to me with the Ebony Maw, the Titania, the Zero. But the other version, which I would probably say I would prefer, I would of course be sharing my Sandman version from last season, which I think was the best Shuri deck around. Unfortunately, the Sandman change means that's no longer a deck which is possible. But this is Dera's Sandman deck from the New York City tournament, and this deck absolutely destroyed me in the tournament itself. He is the guy that knocked me out. I was very confident into these Shuri decks, but the addition of Vision is very spicy indeed, because that is going to be very difficult for Shang-Chi's to deal with, as you can just be moving your Vision around. The Cosmo as well helps protect you from cards like Shang-Chi, from cards like Aero as well, and it still has the Taskmaster, the Zola, as well as that surprise Magneto on turn number 6, which can really catch your opponent off guard and help you win those 8 cube games. I think this is probably the best deck in the game. Bunch of different ways you can go about playing Shuri, of course, but this just seems like the best deck in the game to me. I think Thanos is a close second, and then if I had to pick a third deck, I'd maybe say Zabu or Sandman. Of course, it's still very on in the season, so these sort of decks which are like tier 2, tier 1, tier 3 are quite difficult to distinguish exactly their power level, but I think it's we can say with quite a lot of confidence that Thanos and Shuri are going to be the top 2 decks this season, at least for the next week until more decks are discovered. Hope you guys enjoyed this Marvel Snap Meta Report snapshot early on in the season. Give the video a like, and if you watch this far, let's say the key word for today in the comments, the code word, if you will, is Big Daddy for Big Daddy Thanos. So that's how I know you've watched the whole video, and I really appreciate your support. See you on the next one. Deuces.